We've been talking about the history of the various laws in the United States under which FDA accrued more and more authority in its oversight of the medical products in this country. But I just want to spend a couple of minutes now introducing you to three terms that really talk a little bit more as to how FDA does its regulations. And as you can imagine, if you were to read the laws, they basically are a framework of what FDA's authorities are, but it really doesn't tell a manufacturer, or it doesn't tell FDA, how do you specifically regulate a particular drug or a particular class of drugs. And in many respects, you probably would not want a law that was that prescriptive, particularly in a field like medicine and drugs where science is continually progressing and new kinds of products are being developed with all kinds of new technologies that people, when the laws were written, could not have even imagined. So indeed, the laws are the foundation, and they bind the agency, they bind the manufacturers, so the provisions in there are what we, as I was saying, are binding on both. And FDA cannot change the law. The manufacturers cannot change the law. Only Congress can change the law and the specific provisions that are in the law. However, as part of the law, Congress gave FDA the authority to make what are called regulations. And these are much more specific requirements for how drugs are regulated, specific requirements for specific kinds of products that have to be met. And FDA has to do this through a process called notice and comment rulemaking, which means when FDA wants to put a regulation out, it has to make public what its thinking is by proposing the rule. Once the rule is publicly proposed, there is a period where the public and anyone is allowed to comment and offer suggestions. And then FDA has to take those suggestions and either put them into the final regulation or explain why they decided not to put them in. But once FDA goes through this process of notice and comment rulemaking, the final rule has the effect of law in that it binds FDA and it binds the manufacturer. But as opposed to law, FDA can change the regulation, again by going through notice and comment rulemaking. These particular regulations can be found in what is called the Code of Federal Regulations, which is a huge manual that all of the executive branch agencies and departments use as a way of making their various regulations public. And the ones that govern the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act are found primarily in what is called 21 CFR, or the 21st volume of the Code of Federal Regulation. But as you can imagine, notice and comment rulemaking can be quite a long procedure. And so FDA does this when there are significant major kinds of requirements that FDA believes are going to be the requirements for an extended period of time. But as we were just mentioning, and as we all know, science and technology are moving along at an incredible speed. And oftentimes as people are developing products, they want to know, really, well, what does FDA think the requirements for this new product are going to be? And there are many ways they can get that kind of information, and we'll talk about that in some subsequent modules when we look at how FDA regulates in more depth. But FDA also has the ability to put out what are called guidances. They do this under what is called good guidance practice. There is also a notice and comment element of this, but it is much quicker, and it allows FDA to put out its current thinking. Now, guidances, because they really do not go through formal notice and comment rulemaking, are not binding on the agency, and they're not binding on the manufacturers. So if you are a manufacturer and you think there is a different way you would like to develop your product that is a good science-based way of doing this, you're perfectly able to do that and come in and have a discussion with FDA about your approach as opposed to the approach FDA had mentioned in its guidances. But I think many of the manufacturers and many people find FDA's guidances quite helpful because it does give a sense of what FDA is thinking about a given issue at the time the guidance puts out. So remember these three terms: law, regulations, both of which are binding on FDA and the manufacturer, and then guidance, which is not binding on either, but which is a way to, in a much more quick way of doing so, to communicate FDA's thinking on a given issue. Now, when you look at the remit that FDA has when we talk about medicines regulation, and again, we'll go into this in much greater detail when we talk about how FDA actually does its regulation. FDA's oversight of medicines is really a life cycle oversight. FDA is involved in the preclinical testing, and that means the testing on the medicine before it ever even goes into people to be tested, in the promulgation of what are known as good laboratory procedures, so that when these medicines are tested in animals prior to their being tested in humans, they're done in a way that meets the scientific requirements and the ethical requirements for testing products in animals. Then FDA also is responsible, as you'll see, for the oversight of the clinical trials, meaning the trials of the drug in humans, to see if indeed it does what the manufacturers think it will do, and to see if ultimately it has that positive benefit risk profile that it needs to have in order to be legally marketed in the United States. Obviously, FDA is involved when it comes to issuing the marketing authorization, or what we call here in the U.S. drug approval, which not only looks at the efficacy and safety of the product, but equally importantly, looks at the ability of the manufacturer to actually manufacture the product at an industrial scale on a continuous basis, so that indeed the product, if it's made today, or if it's made 6 months from now, or a year from now, will behave the same as did the product that was in the clinical trials. Because clearly you want to have a product, particularly products that people are taking on a chronic basis, that as they get their medicines refilled over time, they can rest assured that the medicine they get today and the medicine they get 6 months from now will indeed perform in their body in exactly the same way. Once a product is authorized for marketing here in the United States, there are many post-authorization activities that FDA, the manufacturer, and the community at large are involved in as we continue to learn more and more about the product, and we further refine our knowledge of the product and how we think that product can best be used in a most efficacious and in a safest way possible. And then the final authority that FDA has is the authority of overseeing the advertising of prescription drugs. Most advertising in the United States is overseen by the Federal Trade Commission, but there is a special carve-out for prescription drugs in the United States, which goes to FDA. So these are kind of the life cycle overview of what FDA is responsible for when we talk about the regulation of medicines here in the United States.